I definitely don't like covering my green beans in, mushroom soup and fried onions. I love good either sauteed green beans or roasted with tomatoes and garlic and lemon. I love all the classics of Thanksgiving, but I personally lean towards lightening all of them up a little bit.
I'm Delia Colon, and this is The Zest. Citrus, seafood, Spanish flavor, and Southern charm. The Zest celebrates cuisine and community in the Sunshine State. Happy Thanksgiving! Today, we're dishing up a smorgasbord of some of our favorite holiday-related conversations. Today, we're dishing up excerpts from some of our favorite conversations related to Thanksgiving and the holiday season. First up is my chat with Andrew Batten of Florida Living History. That's an educational nonprofit based in St. Augustine. Now, he says, forget what you learned in grade school about the Pilgrims in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Many historians now believe that the real first Thanksgiving meal took place in modern-day St. Augustine, Florida. And if you think about the path that the Europeans took to get to North America, they landed in Florida before they landed in the northern states, so it just makes sense. So Andrew Batten is here to tell us about some of the foods that might have been on that first Thanksgiving table.
My particular area of interest has always been foodways and culinary history. So I look at the fusion of European, native, and African cuisines in Florida and how it influenced not only the way they ate then, but the way we eat now.
So I want to talk first about squash.
Mm-hmm.
I've recently been experimenting with squash. I've made some things with like acorn squash, spaghetti squash, butternut squash. There are so many wonderful squashes and they're so hearty. So when we talk about historic uses of squash in Florida, what exactly are we talking about?
Well, we're looking at the whole family, so including pumpkins, which would have been a major food group in the Southeast, which were eaten many different ways, also dried. A dried pumpkin is an excellent sweetener, and it will keep for a long time. So when you don't have access to honey or sugar or maple syrup or anything like that, you can use dried pumpkin. So that's an ingredient that both the European colonists used, but the natives used as well. And then pumpkin can be eaten almost any way. It was roasted, it was stuffed. The Spanish actually took that from the natives and would make a very rich stuffing, put it in the pumpkin, bake it, and then slice it like a pie. And so everyone would get some of the meat of the pumpkin and then also the filling, whatever that was.
Oh, that sounds good and very Thanksgiving-y.
Yes.
Are you talking about like a similar bread-based stuffing like we would have today?
It could be bread. It could be rice. Often it would include meat. It might have, the Spanish might do it with onions and garlic, that sort of a thing. And then further north, the Europeans did it where it was, it seems to me almost like a meatloaf with breading stuffed into the pumpkin and then baked.
So it's like a whole meal almost.
Exactly. That's just it. Then you just slice it like a pie and everyone gets a chunk.
My mouth is starting to water already. Tell me more about the dried pumpkin. Is it powdery, and what kind of things would they be sweetening with it?
Well,
I just ran out of sugar, so I may actually need to do this.
What you can do, you just slice it very thin, hang it up to dry. And then it can be used for many, many different things. It can be mixed in with other ingredients. So if you were cooking dried corn, what we would think of as grits, essentially, you could sweeten it with that. It was used to sweeten beverages. In the northern colonies, they would mix it with beer, molasses, and then a shot of rum and heat the whole thing up. So that's where pumpkin ale comes from today. Originally, pumpkin was used as a flavoring and a sweetener because you lacked anything else. You didn't have access to sugar, molasses, whatever it was. Pumpkin is cheap, grows outside your door, keep all winter long as it's kept dry. So a useful plant that way.
Yeah, very useful. Just don't carve it here in Florida. I learned that the hard way. It'll keep for like 3 hours and then it'll start to get moldy.
Exactly.
So is pumpkin and these squashes, are those native to the Americas? And is this something that the Europeans were introduced to when they came to the Americas?
Exactly. So squash would have been something that they would have encountered here. Many different varieties, although at this point it's a little bit hard to say exactly which ones. The pumpkins that they would have had, for example, are still grown in Mexico and are still sold in a lot of Latin American markets. They're called calabazas. They're large but sort of flat. They're greenish more than orange. And that has the nice texture and the meaty texture for holding up while you bake it. And so we know that those would have been common all up and down the eastern seaboard. As a matter of fact, one of the things probably served at the first Thanksgiving would have been what they would have called stewed pompions, which is where pumpkin came from, which they served as a side dish for meat. So they would actually boil them down and make almost a gravy out of the pumpkins. And
the Europeans did that, you're saying?
Europeans did that. Now, they probably learned that from the natives. And of course, because there were more natives than Europeans at the first Thanksgiving, it may have been a gesture of cordiality to their guests that they served that alongside the venison and the other dishes.
Now, do you believe that the first Thanksgiving was in Florida?
Well, yes, the real first Thanksgiving was definitely 1565. And what's interesting about that is that I actually cooked what they suspect is the first Thanksgiving meal for my family. I didn't serve it on Thanksgiving, though, because I like it, but it's very disappointing to the typical American taste. It's a hearty bean stew and then served with guava jelly, hard biscuits, and wine. So I enjoyed it, but not what most people would think of.
I think I would actually enjoy that, too. I love a bean stew. Maybe if you dip the biscuit in the stew, it's not so hard.
Probably what they did. Probably broke it up and then soaked it in the stew.
Well, you and I could have Thanksgiving together.
See, very good. Very good indeed.
That was Andrew Batten of Florida Living History in St. Augustine. Not only does Florida deserve credit as the site of the first Thanksgiving, I hope by now we can all agree, but Andrew says Florida also has bragging rights as the birthplace of fusion cuisine.
Centuries before the rest of the world even heard the term or thought of the term, Florida was living fusion cuisine. And by that I mean the Spanish came here, interacted with Native Americans, learned their food ways, then Africans came, and their food ways were introduced. And the great irony of all of this is that out of this came what we consider all American food, which of course it isn't. It's European and Spanish and North African and West African and South American, all blended together into what we would eat at Sonny's Barbecue.
That's so funny because I think of fusion as like a relatively new term within the past couple of decades, but you're saying it's centuries old. So how far back are we going and where in Florida are we talking about?
Well, the fusion of cuisines actually started before the first Europeans ever landed in the New World. Spain was already a fusion cuisine because they had European foods, they had North African foods from the Moors who invaded. So they had Islamic influences, they had Mediterranean influences, they had Middle Eastern food, they had a strong Jewish population, so there were a lot of Jewish traditions in Spanish cooking. So 1,000 years ago, the Spanish were already enjoying fusion cuisine. But when they came to America, it really began to percolate in the 17th and then the early 18th centuries, when through their introduction to Native American foodways and then especially African foodways beginning around the 1690s and then continuing through the first half of the 18th century, the Spanish got this sort of kickstart of new ingredients, new ways of cooking. And so it all began to blend together in Florida. And I would say most specifically in St. Augustine in the early part of the 18th century.
This is fascinating. Give us the Cliffs Notes history lesson of how these different groups ended up together in St. Augustine.
Well, of course, the Spanish arrived in St. Augustine in the 1560s. 1565 they arrived. And they brought with them a lot of their foods and their traditions. The most important one really for Florida's history was pigs. They brought them in large quantities. There were already pigs that had been introduced to Florida probably about 30 years earlier. And as pigs do, they had reproduced wildly. So there were vast numbers of wild pigs all throughout the Southeast. But what the Spanish started doing was they were preparing pork, which was their national favorite meat, but they started preparing it in the way that they had learned from the natives in the Caribbean. And so you start to see them smoking it over fires in what would have been called a barbacoa, which is what the natives of the Caribbean called it, which is where we get the word barbecue. So you're cooking traditional Spanish food, but cooking it in a Native American fashion. And then you add to this the ingredients that they took when they arrived in Central and South America, things like sweet potatoes, pumpkins, sweet peppers, hot peppers. All of these are rapidly introduced into Spanish cooking. One of the things that's so interesting about the Spanish is they were much more broad-minded than most Europeans when it came to food. Somebody once said that the British, everywhere they went, they wanted to eat like they were still in England. But the Spanish weren't like that. They were very open to new ideas. So they introduced corn into their diet. They introduced peppers. They introduced squashes and beans and all of these different things that they encounter in the New World. And then a third strain comes in. Beginning in the 1690s in St. Augustine, you start to have African peoples who have escaped from enslavement in the English colonies. They make their way to Florida, and they bring with them some of their food ways. And so a lot of things that I grew up eating, thinking this was real old-fashioned American Southern cooking, things like okra, yams, collard greens. I had no idea, black-eyed peas, no idea. These were all indigenous to West Africa. So these were introduced into the American diet by the African peoples who were on the East Coast of America, and specifically here in St. Augustine in Fort Mose. It was a free settlement. These people would have planted and harvested the crops they were familiar with from West Africa. And so by that means, they make their way into the American diet, and within a very short time, they are thought of as absolutely distinctly American foods, when of course they're not.
Wasn't that so fascinating learning about what the early Floridians ate? Now, your holiday table probably looks a little different today, especially depending on your family's roots. In our next excerpt, radio personality Yanira Yaya Cardona of Jacksonville explains what holidays are like for her modern Puerto Rican family.
We start celebrating Thanksgiving Day. We start doing parrandas, which is also something that's tradition in Puerto Rico, which is our version of Christmas caroling, but way more fun. My family is super huge. So what we do is we wait till it's about midnight and a group of us go to a family's house and we go and sing our Christmas caroling songs, is not sleeping music. We wake you up. And everybody always knows, like the people know during Christmas time to be ready to receive a parranda at any time. You're not warned when we're going to come through. We don't let you know how many people are going to come. So you just have to be prepared at all times during Christmas to have alcohol in your house and or food for a group of people, or to be waking up at whatever time. So at midnight, like I said, we go to the person's house. We start singing Christmas songs. They open the doors to us. We go inside. We'll have a couple of drinks there. They join us. And then we go to another family's house. We do the same thing at their house, repeat it. And then they join us. And then we go to a third house. So typically it's 3 houses that we go to in one night. And the third house is the one that typically like makes the soup and all that. And that's like almost always like around 1 in the morning. And so we're there to like at least 3, 4 in the morning while we wrap up, eat and all that. And it's just a lot of fun. It's a tradition that you see a lot in Puerto Rico. The neighbors don't get upset. The neighbors a lot of times join us also because of course they wake up and so they come along. And, in Puerto Rico, we're all neighbors are families for the most part. So it's just a beautiful tradition that we really have in Puerto Rico.
I love that. What kind of soup is the third house serving?
So it could be anywhere from chicken soup, plantain soup with balls of plantain inside of them. So good. garbanzo soup, just any kind of soup typically is what they make.
I just think that's such a great tradition. What distinguishes Puerto Rican food from other Latin American food traditions? Because I think a lot of people want to lump it all together and just say everything is tacos and beans and rice.
It's not. Our main protein or meat is pork. You would think because of being in an island, it would be seafood. Actually not, it's pork. Our traditional plate for holidays, especially now for Christmas, is arroz con gandules, pasteles, ensalada de coditos or ensalada de papa, and tostones o amarillos. Oh, and of course, lechon asado. So lechon asado is a roasted pork. It's literally a tradition in my family every 24th to roast a pig at my great uncle's house. Every year, the whole family gets together there. We roast a pig. Our aunts or grandmothers are making the arroz con gandules, and everybody's helping make the ensalada de papa o codito. So everyone is literally in the kitchen helping, and the men are roasting the pigs, which could take up to 12 hours to roast a pig.
Okay, we got to go back and translate for the people listening. No listener left behind. What were those holiday foods again? You talked about salads and you talked about rice and beans, and what else?
Yes, so arroz con gandules is rice with, I think it's chickpeas in English.
Mm-hmm.
And that's our traditional rice. And then we typically have a cold macaroni salad with mayonnaise and chopped ham in it. Again, there's that pork. And then if not the macaroni salad, you'll definitely get a potato salad, which is also mayonnaise based. You'll get the pasteles. Pasteles is our traditional. You know how I'm going to go ahead and just say this. You know, in Mexico, they have the tamal. This is Puerto Rican's version of our tamal, but it's made out of green bananas and you boil them to cook them. You boil pasteles and you can stuff it. Typically it's stuffed with some kind of beef inside of it, or they do it chicken. They can do chicken inside of it too. So that's our traditional plate right there. Is arroz con gandules, tamal. And then of course you have el lechon asado, which is roasted pork.
That'll keep you full probably till the new year at least. Tell me more about the men roasting the pork. Are they roasting the whole pig, or how does that work?
It's definitely a 2-day process. So the night before they come, obviously they get the pig and they cut it in half and they lay it out completely flat. They try to flatten it out as much as they can. And then they season the pork, and typically it's seasoned with olive oil mixed with all kind of herbs inside of it. Everyone has their own way of making their seasoning, but typically it's like olive oil with their own kind of herbs, and they rub it all over the pork. They wrap it up that night. They wrap it up on the pole. And then that morning, typically like at 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning, they put the pig on a wooden fire and they start roasting it. And so the old way, they would have to take turns, literally turning the pole of the pig. So that way the whole pig can get the same amount of heat throughout the whole time. Now they have a machine that, is easy. Anyone can just now sit down and watch it. But the traditional way, the men sit out there for the 12 hours and, they take turns. They play dominoes, they drink, they storytell, we dance. The kids also participate. We also take turns turning the pig. And then once the pig is completely done, we obviously take it out, and typically the oldest member in the family is the one that starts to chop it up into pieces so we can start getting dinner ready.
Wow. So it's almost like maybe the person of honor would slice the Thanksgiving turkey.
Yes.
So we've heard about what Floridians ate in the past and what holiday dinners are like for some Floridians of Puerto Rican descent today. And what about your holiday table? In our final excerpt, let's revisit my conversation with Chef Richard Anderson of Oxford Exchange in Tampa. He shares how to adapt some traditional fall foods for Florida's warmer climate.
Florida, we have, of course, there's fall and spring and all that stuff, but it just blurs one right into the other. And then by the time you're like, I think tonight's the night I'm going to turn the heat on, it's warm again the next day. But yeah, at the restaurant, I make seasonal menu changes. And once fall comes, maybe lean more towards like some of the comfort foods, tomato soups and kind of warm chilies and things like that, where they're not going to order so much in June.
I do the same thing. Like as soon as it's 70 degrees, I'm like, I'm wearing my boots and my turtleneck and I'm making chili, but it's still hot outside.
It's still hot out, but it's December, so you feel like it's time. Yeah.
Is there a way we can adapt some of those recipes? Especially, like, I'm from Ohio. I have albums, I store recipes in photo albums from my mom, and I have all these recipes that are from up north. We have a lot of people who come here seasonally. How can we adapt some of those heavier recipes for Florida?
I think just lighten up the ingredients. I think if it's more of the full comfort foods and maybe you're into more of like the gravies and the creams and the cheeses and season hits and you want to lighten it up a little bit, go more broths and citrus and chilies and fresh herb. And you can kind of play off the same recipe, but scaling back some of the heaviness and maybe some of the calories and lightening it all up, adding more citrus, like I said.
I love root vegetables, and to me, they are so fall. I usually just roast them with olive oil and salt, but do you have any more maybe creative ideas?
Creative, maybe, but you're on the right page. I mean, once potatoes are awesome and parsnips and carrots, and I think that is the best way to do it. I think just roasting it with olive oil, fresh herb, thyme, salt, pepper. I think just letting them be as good as they are. That's always been my little key to success is once it's good, all I'm looking to do is just accent it a little bit. I'm not trying to change it. I'm not trying to cover it. I'm not trying to hide it. If it's really good and I decide that's what I want for dinner, then I'm going to let that be its own thing.
Okay, this makes me think of Thanksgiving when we're talking about fall foods, because I feel like Thanksgiving, go to your happy place. Football is on. It's cold outside-ish. You're watching the parade. I feel like Thanksgiving is one of those occasions when we overdo the food. Like we have the sweet potatoes with the marshmallows on top and the green bean casserole and with the weird crunchy stuff. Can you offer any suggestions to kind of lighten up those classics?
Yeah.
What do you make Thanksgiving dinner?
I do, even if it's just 4 people at my house. We still make Thanksgiving depending on the amount of people. Maybe we scale it up or scale it back, but we always do a really good Thanksgiving dinner. But personally, I kind of lean just more towards healthier eating. I love the indulgence and I'll splurge and eat burgers and stuff too, but I definitely don't like covering my green beans in, mushroom soup and fried onions. I love good either sauteed green beans or roasted with tomatoes and garlic and lemon. I love all the classics of Thanksgiving, but I personally lean towards lightening all of them up a little bit.
All right, how do we lighten up the sweet potatoes with the marshmallows?
You don't add the marshmallows. Sweet potatoes are awesome, and if you roast them in their skins low and slow and you'll almost notice when you do it right, they almost have like a syrup that comes out of the skin. They are so sweet, they're like candy already. I can't handle them with brown sugar and marshmallows. Then it's too sweet for me. Yeah. So if I'm gonna make mashed sweet potatoes, once they get there, it's just some butter, some salt, a little bit of maybe coconut milk if you don't do dairy, and they're ready to be whipped and mashed and served.
Last thing, turkey. What do you do to your turkey? I gave up and I just buy the frozen, pre-seasoned one. But in my defense, I am a vegetarian, so I'm not about that life of tasting. I'm not tasting it. I just need to know. And it's so high pressure. You wake up at the crack of dawn, you stick your hand in the cavity and you're doing all this gross stuff, and you have to wait like hours and hours before you even find out if you did a good job.
The turkey is what stresses everybody out, and it's really not that difficult. Always brine your turkey. That's my biggest pointer, brine your turkey, and all that is a water, salt, and sugar solution. So it helps put in seasoning into your turkey and moisture and drive some of that sodium into the turkey. It just gives you a much more moist bird once it's all done. But season it, roast it simply with a little bit of butter on the outside. I personally like to do it really low and slow until I get it close to the internal temp at like 165, 170, and then turn the heat up for the last 30 minutes, baste it in butter, and then get all my color on it. I think a lot of people start it too high and they get the bird, perfectly browned and it's still raw in the center. It's like, well, how am I going to get this thing from not burned to cooked in the center? I do it opposite. I'll go really low and slow, like 250, bring that thing up for a few hours. And then as it's getting closer and closer, start cranking the heat up to like 375, butter it, rotate it. And then once you get that golden color, hopefully it's matching the color to when it's about done on the inside.
Yeah, it's like midnight.
It sounds complicated. It's pretty easy.
We hope you enjoyed this holiday feast. Thanks to Andrew Batten, Yaya Cardona, and Richard Anderson. For more holiday meal inspiration, check out the collection of recipes on our website, thezestpodcast.com. I'm Dalia Colon. I produce The Zest with Andrew Lucas and Alexandria Ebron. The Zest is a production of WUSF, copyright 2024, part of the NPR network.